Good evening. Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and with us tonight is Father Deacon John. Deacon John, how are we doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
Good. It's good to be able to speak this topic with you. I don't know if people are aware, but you've been a Uniat for a couple decades, and you have
technically not all the time, like kind of off and on, and then officially the last few years before I became Orthodox.
So because you were explaining, like, you married, right? You married into, your wife was a Uniat, and so you're worshiping together.
It's really complicated, so maybe we just won't get into it.
Yeah. So the point is, he's been around the scene for 20 years, worshipped at the Uniats, gives us a good background of what Uniats believe, what they're like. And both of us agreed from the onset, the point of this show isn't to bash Uniatism, or really to bash Roman Catholicism. I'm sure you have many friends within the Uniat communion, and respect a lot of people within Uniatism. And again, like myself, people know me from these YouTube videos, but like I don't have this thing against Roman Catholics in the real world. I mean, just today, down the street from my work is a Marian shrine in Syracuse, New York, and they actually allegedly have even relics of St. Peter and several of the apostles, little bone chips. And it's signed off from Rome and all that. So these are probably as high grade a relic as you could get. There's been problems with relics of the centuries. So the point is, today I went to the Roman Catholic Marian shrine. I was able to venerate relics that were there, at least of my own saints and our own saints, because we're both Orthodox. But I found that today apparently is like the 40-year anniversary of Our Lady of Medjugorje, however you pronounce it. Now, we Orthodox do not accept this. In fact, many Roman Catholics do not accept this. But in popular Roman Catholic piety, this apparition is very popular. And I say this because there's a lot of good, decent Roman Catholic people that are pious. And in their everyday life, they are very much looking forward to hearing new things about Mary at work. They view that because there's less public apparitions within Orthodoxy, there's some sort of deficiency. They're otherwise very nice people. So I say this because they could look at us and find some things kind of awkward, and we could look at them and find things some kind of awkward. But it's okay because we're not one another. So differences between each other could be awkward. And so tonight we're not trying to say like, wow, look at Uniatism, they're weird. Uniatism is mostly a movement within certain regions. So there's ethnic splits, geographic splits, historical circumstances, and we'll try to cover some of these in a neutral manner with the humility of knowing all of our respective ethnic backgrounds, even our respective Orthodox jurisdictions, have been shaped by ethnicity, by history, and by circumstance. So the Uniats would be no different in this regard. But that being said, I want to really not hear myself pontificate about this, because really I'm not someone who has firsthand experience with Uniatism, but you, Deacon John, do. So before maybe we get into any like real deep questions, you mind giving us maybe a brief synopsis of what Uniatism is?
Well, first of all, I'm not really sure how it happened, but the term uniate or uniatism is viewed as derogatory now, even though after the Union of Brest, the structure that was created because of that was called the Ruthenian Uniate Church. So I'm not sure exactly why that became a derogatory term, but that's generally how what the Eastern, they prefer to call themselves Eastern Rite Catholics. I don't know why that is, but all the Orthodox I talk to continue to refer to them as uniates. So apparently it's derogatory, and I have no idea why.
Well, a lot of words become derogatory for no good reason.
Well, kind of the general, the history kind of, it depends how you ask how it's interpreted, because I'll I'll get different responses from different people. I know there were some Franciscans who were rather scandalized by the recounting of the history of how that came about, whereas Ukrainian Catholic priests, it's like, well, this is our history. It's like, what scandals? This is what we went through. So it's difficult to get into a lot of the history, but generally what happened was the Mongols, at least as far as like with the Ukrainians and the Ruthenians, and it's usually the Union of Brest that's acknowledged as the first one as the Uniate model, although there's also the Maronites that claim that they've never been out of union with Rome. But then you'll get people from that part of the world that say that's not so. And so there's lots of controversy. But at least with the Ukrainians and the Ruthenians, that part of the world was overrun by the Mongols. And actually, my wife's half Ukrainian, and I like to refer to her eyes as Mongolian eyes. So, and after they pulled out, my ancestors got involved, the Lithuanians, and dominated the regions. And at least the aristocracy and parts of Lithuania had become Roman Catholic by that point. Some of the rural areas, specifically where my closer ancestors came from, they remained pagan until the Lutherans evangelized them. But the Roman Catholics dominated what would eventually become Ukraine, or I think it was called Little Russia, or was it? Yeah, Little Russia. I don't know my history that well. Just pick up bits in here. And then there was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then the Counter-Reformation started. And it was most successful in Poland, and it wasn't just focused on the Protestants, but in what would become Ukraine, it also very much was. Well, a lot of Ukrainian Catholics will say that there was oppression, there was political oppression, and this is why the Union of Brest came about. And some of them feel a bit resentful that after the Union of Brest happened, then the Orthodox were kind of given equal rights again, and they thought that was unfair. But anyways, that's kind of a summary. Some people don't particularly like some of those details, but other Ukrainian Catholics, clergy and stuff say, well, that's exactly what happened, and we don't want to dismiss what we went through in order to be in union with Rome, because the main focus has always been union in Rome. A lot of them refer to themselves as Orthodox, in union in union with Rome, or in communion with Rome. So that's kind of it.
And we'll talk more about that a little bit in a moment. But I'm putting up on the screen a map, and so I'm going to kind of give a synopsis of what we're talking about. So really, the whole area we see here with Pskov, Novgorod would be to the north. We see there, we see Smolensk. Moscow wouldn't be, I think that's not Moscow, it's somewhere else. Moscow would be more to the east here.
Yeah.
But I want to focus particularly on a river, which would be the Dnieper, all right? And so we see the Dnieper here, the big blue one right here, and it's in the middle of the screen. This is the Black Sea. Yeah. Now, the reason this is relevant is because if we focus on that, and I'm going to unzoom a little bit, we could kind of see the Dnieper to the bottom right, is Lithuania. If you know anything about European geography, it's pretty much near the Baltic Sea, which would be the top left. Lithuania and Poland pretty much had like this, I don't know if dual monarchy is the right word, but they had intertwined royal families. At some point, Lithuania had ascendancy, and a few centuries later, really, Poland had ascendancy. But why is this relevant? All this at one point to the west of the Dnieper River was part of Kiev Rus. And really, Ukraine, as we call it today, was really Rus. And the Rurikids, which were a Viking ruling dynasty, they ruled up to Novgorod, which would be north of Pskov, which is the top of the map, and down to Kiev. And of course, Mongols made it all the way to Constantinople. Vikings made it all the way to Constantinople. So all this would have been Slavic, Rus people. And then the Golden Horde came and pretty much kind of split in half this map we see here between north and south. Muscovy was a tributary of the Golden Horde of the Mongols. Pretty much it means they paid money to have some level of independence. Novgorod was very similar in this regard. Kiev was often under Lithuanian domination because of the power vacuum that the Golden Horde introduced. And this power vacuum lasted for centuries and really didn't start reversing itself until after the Time of Troubles, which is the late 1500s, after Ivan the Terrible died. And for the next 100 or so years into the 1700s, really, Poland at that point continually started losing ground. So why is this relevant? This is relevant because even Poland at one time, Lithuania, all of them were originally evangelized as Slavic Christians, as Orthodox. And as Poland became Latinized, people under Polish domination and Lithuanian domination essentially were crusading and converting Orthodox to Latin Rite. But the further they were from Poland, and I'm going to kind of get closer to like the area that'd be Poland, you can see Warsaw in the middle, the more Latin they were. And the further away, the less they were able to really exert themselves. And that means they maintained greater orthodoxy. So it's really not too complicated for the stereotype this. The further east you go, the more Orthodox, and that's the furthest extent, even past the Donets River. So you're going past Rostov. There's, I think, Rostov. I don't know if it's Rostov on the Don, but at least past Rostov, you even had Polish domination. But that's so far from, again, Lithuania and Poland, they couldn't seriously change the bishops to convert people. But when you go further west, the Kiev, which was under Polish and Lithuanian domination for centuries, they had significant more success. And then further west you go, and you get into Galicia and parts which are even now part of Poland today, which were part of Ukraine at one point. They are Uniate, if not then fully Latinized. And so this is important because people have to understand that for better or for worse, again, if you're a Roman Catholic, a lot of this could be for the sake of their salvation, right? Because Roman Catholics at least used to believe that communing the Pope was something necessary for salvation, that these historical circumstances are providential to bring these people into the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, we Orthodox disagree with that. But if you kind of see the East-West divide, to fast forward to the modern day, you think of Ukraine and you think of east and west of the Dnieper River will give you a pretty good stereotype of where will be more Union heavy, less Union heavy, more Moscow Patriarchate and more really schismatic Ukrainians and Uniates, which happen to be very close, which we'll get into more detail. So being that we kind of gave you this broad literal lay of the land, I want to get a little more into kind of the nitty-gritty of Uniatism. And I think maybe this open-ended question might help us start unpacking that with you, Deacon John, because, again, you're the expert. I could read a map, and for the fun of it, I've been reading this for years. It's not me LARPing. This is mine from college. And I got maps of this stuff from college because I took 2 courses of Russian history back in the day. So it's this stuff I've been privy to for a long time. But let me ask you this.
Well, actually, I'll say the way I simplify it is you start in the western part and you say Horilka, and as you go east, you say Gurilka, and you go far enough east, you say vodka.
All right, that's a joke that doesn't make sense to these outsiders. Could you explain it to us?
There's like a Russian sort of pronunciation of Ukrainian, and then there's the Ukrainian. And
there you go.
It's been explained to me that Ukrainians can understand both Ukrainian and Russians don't understand Ukrainian. I've heard the same thing about like with the Austrians. The Austrians understand the Germans, but the Germans don't understand the Austrians. So I mean, there's that linguistic. If you go back far enough, they're related, but then there gets the separation and stuff.
You know, it's interesting because I've asked the Slovaks. I said, "Well, how about you and the Czechs?" And they go, "Oh, we speak the same, and we are the same." And you ask the Czechs, "How about you and the Slovaks?" And they say, "No, we're different."
Yeah. And actually, I found out that the word vodka is actually Polish. It's not actually Russian. So, which creates even more confusion. And then the Lithuanians, like the Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians, they're not Slavs. They're Baltics. And Lithuania was actually the last so-called Christianized state because it was difficult to invade. So there were a few Christians, supposedly from the evangelization of Cyril and Methodius, but it wasn't until the Teutonic Knights went on crusade, the Northern Crusade, sent on crusade by Pope Celestine III, I believe it was, and that's that's kind of the Christianization of the first Lithuanian king was King Mindaugas, and apparently it was more a political thing, and he basically reverted back to paganism afterwards. That's my understanding.
Well, sucks to be him.
You can get into all these details. It gets extremely complicated, and then it gets very controversial.
But let's start open-ended and maybe we get more laser focused. So let me ask this basic question, because a lot of people, when they start becoming interested in Orthodoxy, are kind of told this siren song. Well, you could have your cake and eat it too. You could be Orthodox, but be in union with the Pope. So you're entitled to have an opinion because you're former Uniate. So let me ask you this. This is your opinion alone. Why can't I be Orthodox and simply have communion with the Pope?
Well, I've thought about that a fair bit, because there is a major difference between the Uniates and the Orthodox, and it's that Uniates don't actually know what that is. And that actually is the problem. Because if you come to, say, a Ukrainian Catholic priest and you ask, well, what is it that the Orthodox believe about this? What's different? They don't know. But then if you go to the Orthodox, they will explain it very clearly, as long as they understand their theology. So that's the biggest difference. And to be very honest, from my reflection on it, it goes back basically to the filioque. And I mean, suddenly we're going back to Pope Adrian and Charlemagne and looking at that. What was it that caused the initial schism between Rome and the Orthodox world? And that's basically what happens. If you're not in communion with the church, you will lose that connection that happened when they adopted the filioque. And that has to do with receiving noetic knowledge. So I mean, that's always the difference. If you're not in communion with the church, you do not have that connection.
And so let me ask this then. You say about the filioque. There's some degree of misinformation saying, oh, well, Uniates don't have the filioque in the creed. Can you kind of give us the kind of nitty gritty of what's the deal with the filioque within the creed when it pertains to the Uniates?
It's really the same problem with the Roman Catholics. Like if you get down to it, but we don't want to discuss that right now. Which see, this is the problem thing. If you don't understand that, you're not going to understand what happened at the Union of Brest. Because at the Union of Brest, it wasn't so much of a requirement, and that was basically because they realized what Ophelia was trying to force it upon the Orthodox at the Council of Florence. And the definition of Florence, that's actually really scandalous, because the vast majority of Roman Catholics would not actually realize how the filioque was defined at Florence, and all the Eastern Catholics would pretty much would reject that understanding, because they very much shut the temporal understanding of the procession of the Holy Spirit. They emphasize that in the creed, which is fine, because there's nothing wrong with that. It's just they don't understand how that like with that quote when we mentioned, you had referenced it, and I looked up with Pope Adrian, how he didn't actually understand how this is only referring to the temporal procession, and it's not referring to the divine essence. And so from my experience, I haven't come across anyone in the Eastern Catholic churches that has an understanding of the distinction between the divine essence and the divine energies. And without that, you don't understand what the problem is with the filioque, and you run into all sorts of theological problems. You don't have an understanding about God. You run into a lot of problems. And you've covered this on a number of your other shows, I'm sure. But that essentially is. And so they've lost that, The thing is that you look at Pope Adrian. He was at the end of the 8th century, and so you read what he wrote. He doesn't understand that distinction, and you can see why they would fall away. So they were still. I mean, there was a schism for a while. Well, Saint Photius the Great. There was that schism there that was healed, and then after a couple centuries, then there was what they called the Great Schism. So the thing is, technically, there was union, but even while there was union, they had lost understanding of what that distinction is. And so you'll find this within the Ukrainian Catholics. That was my experience, that they don't understand that. And even listening to Ruthenian Catholic priests, they don't understand what that distinction is and what the consequences are because of that.
Yeah, it's on the dogmatic level. The Council of Florence puts the filioque in Greek using the term proceed, that like as it is in the Gospel of John, the Father and the Son. So like you'll see all these modern theologians trying to make an ecumenical point, an ecumenist point, and say, well, look, we don't mean the eternal procession, and this word, you couldn't use it like that or it'd be heretical. But the problem is in Florence, they did use that word for procession. So that's an issue. And if I remember correctly, in the Union of Brest, they also had the filioque. So this is something that's been around a long time. So even if in the 20th century, they started walking some of this stuff back, and even as you were referring to, it's not that actual Latinized filioquism was really well understood and catechized among the Uniates. There certainly was a confusion because they did have the creed, and it was the filioque was in that creed. So being that we're talking about some of this, how about you give us the highlights of what the doctrinal differences the Uniates have between the Orthodox Catholics and, which is us, and themselves. I mean, why can't, as we said, you be Orthodox but be in communion with the Pope? What are the doctrinal differences of the Uniates from your personal experience?
Well, it varies a lot depending on parish to parish and how much they've kind of reformed. And this is varied a lot over the years. And like if you were to go to a parish that a Basilian parish or one by the Redemptorists, it would be very much more Latinized than, say, some that are trying to really get back and get rid of all the Latinizations. Because it was more recently that a lot of parishes started to get rid of the filioque because they had been using it before. I don't know if this has changed now, but when that was going on, they kept it in Ukraine, actually, because the regular people, they didn't understand this, and they associated having the filioque as being Ukrainian Catholic and not having it being oppressed by the Soviets. And this also too, like you've seen the Russian vestments that, like, they call it the high back for the priest. And well, the most Uniates have like a low back, kind of like what the Greeks and Romanians have. But some Ukrainian Catholics that want to get back to what, the Kevin Rus, the ancient traditions, they'll start using the high backs, but they'll be careful because that'll offend some of the laity in Ukraine, because they associate that with Soviet oppression. So it gets really, really.
And to interrupt, for those not aware, after 1942, Stalinist policy was a forced conversion of Uniates to Sergian Eastern Orthodoxy, and people should be aware that was really the first time it seriously happened within the whole history of the Orthodox Church. So it's an exceptional occurrence, but it did in fact occur, and people are still alive that lived through this.
Yeah, and the reality is that there's a lot of Eastern Catholics will point to that, saying that was an abuse of the Orthodox Church. But the Orthodox Church had nothing to do with this. And actually, the Orthodox Church will look at it as abuse themselves, because they were being forced, like, unknowingly, like they were infiltrated by the KGB and KGB assets and stuff. But then they're being infiltrated by people who weren't Orthodox and weren't interested in being Orthodox. So, I mean, that's creating that's creating all sorts of chaos in the Russian Orthodox Church. So you had people who didn't acknowledge that they were really Orthodox. Like they went through the seminaries, they got ordained, and then in 1990, it's like, well, we're actually Ukrainian Catholic. Goodbye. And, I mean, that's basically what happened. So I mean, regardless of whether you're Ukrainian Catholic, yes, that was abuse. If you're Orthodox, that was also abuse, because you're kind of forcing them together, and they didn't actually believe the same thing. So I mean, it creates a lot of arguments.
And it's not just in Ukraine. The same thing happened in Czechoslovakia and stuff like that. It was a horrible policy, and there's still repercussions today. But let me say, we talked about how there's no essence energy distinction among the Uniats. There's the Filioque. Is there any other crucial doctrinal differences that you really think stick out? Obviously,
well, they do acknowledge the Immaculate Conception, but that gets hazy, because in the Orthodox liturgy we refer to Mary being immaculate
conceived.
It just gets confusing for them because they don't understand how this works. Of course, I'm speaking rather generally. There might be some that have more of an idea. I know my wife would ask me, what is it that Roman Catholics believe about this particular subject? And I finally started to say, I really don't know, because I wasn't a very good Roman Catholic, and I didn't quite believe what they believed. And I don't think I completely understand it. So, I mean, we can't be too generalistic here, because there's lots of variations in how people interpret the various understandings. But that is one thing, is the Immaculate Conception. Of course, that's acknowledged. It might be kind of, they might celebrate it on December 9th rather than December 8th, and actually refer to it as the conception of the Theotokos by Saint Anne. So there's that. Another thing is with indulgence.
I just want to point out real quick that difference of one day is crucial, because within the Orthodox calendar, St. John the Baptist and the Theotokos, their dates of conception, the dates of the births, are 9 months apart, minus or added 1 day. Only Christ is a perfect 9 months. And so the adjustment in the Roman Catholic calendar makes the conception and birth of Theotokos a perfect 9 months. And so we, as Orthodox, don't believe it's coincidental that, even though we believe that Theotokos and St. John the Baptist were sinless and they were cleansed of sin even from being in the womb, we don't believe that their births were immaculate in the sense that Christ was without original sin.
Huh. That's something that I've often wondered, and have asked a number of Ukrainian Catholic clergy, and they didn't really know. So I just learned something.
Very good. To be honest, I just did it by counting.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Well, I never bothered to take a look at the conception of Christ and Christmas like that. So I played around with the calendar a fair bit too, trying to figure out what is the significance, but I never came up with that.
So it's you're about to talk about indulgences.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting thing, because again, this would not so much be the case in, say, a Redemptorist or a Basilian parish, but in a one that's trying to reclaim their more ancient traditions. If there's an indulgence that's been granted by the Pope for some particular thing, the Uniatists will say, well, we don't actually believe in purgatory, so we don't actually take part in that. But if you're at a Basilian parish, they might do all of it. So that's this, that's it gets confusing to that. And the problem is that they acknowledge that, and yet they're still in union with people that have different beliefs. So that it's very ecumenical in that respect. And of course, that is the big push, is ecumenism. Like the biggest push for ecumenism is the Eastern Rite Catholics, because they have a lot of problems with a lot of Roman Catholic dogmas. I mean, the fact that it's dogmatized that Rome has said that the church is Roman. it doesn't make sense historically and stuff, but there are a number of councils where they specify that it is specifically Roman, and that just doesn't work for the Eastern Catholics. So, I mean, there's a problem right there. So that they have to kind of gloss over a lot of things. It's kind of like the indult that was granted to commemorate Nestorius. And there was a couple of, I think it was the Chalcedonian Catholics, they started commemorating him. Although they don't say that he's a saint. I don't know quite how that works, but it gets confusing. So there's a lot of confusing things there that just don't quite add up. But they kind of
and I don't think they try to resolve it, because like the Union of Brest brings in Uniates that venerate St. Gregory Palamas. Here's someone, and St. Mark of Ephesus. People define the Filioque, define the Pope. St. Mark of Ephesus defied the Council of Florence, which really created real Uniatism. There was crusading before that, but generally they try to convert everyone Latin right. I mean, this created like real Uniatism, and he's a saint. And so it's, in some respects, it works very well with modernist and postmodern sensibilities, because there is no absolute truth. So it doesn't matter if everyone has these different opinions. Well, our heart's in the right place. That's what's important. So in a weird way, Uniatism is ahead of its time, and not on purpose, right? It's not like, this sort of subjectivity was something that created Uniatism. It's more of a historical accident. It depends upon what was Polish and Lithuanian policy in a certain bishopric in a certain area, and how much military force could they exert there. And then when they got kicked out, how much military force was the Tsar able to exert there. And so it's different region and region, village to village, town to town, in Ukraine itself. And so just by default, you just have people go, well, we're not Russian, so we have this in common. And it makes it easier to look past maybe some of your specific religious differences, whether they be doctrinal or whether they be with popular piety. But let me ask about that.
Well, the thing is that, like, people who have studied this, looked at the history and stuff, they try to figure this all out, but the common person doesn't actually put that much effort into it. So I did hear a story that there was once a Ukrainian, he got stranded on a deserted island, and because he was very pious, he built a church. And when he has built that church, he went to the other end of the island and built another church. And eventually he got rescued, and people rescued him. They says, well, we understand why you built a church, because you're so pious, but why did you build that other church? And he says, well, this is the church I go to, and that's the church I don't go to. I mean, there you go. Very much that attitude. There's a difference, but they don't necessarily know what it is. At least that was the understanding that I got from the Ukrainian Catholics. When I started spending more time with the Orthodox, they seemed to know what the difference is. There was a very specific reason why they didn't go to that other church. So it's hard to tell what is possibly propaganda pushed for an ecumenism, and what is actually how everyone believes. Like, it gets very complicated. That actually reminds me, today is an appropriate day to be doing this, because it's the Metropolitan Anufi's name day. He's the Metropolitan of Kiev.
Oh, really?
So yeah, it was. I thought that was pretty nice that we happen to be doing this today, this live stream.
Oh, so on purpose. You have no idea. So anyway, so anyway, let me ask you this: what are the differences in popular piety between Uniates and Orthodox, and maybe even Uniates and Uniates? Like, and we're talking about rosary stuff. How are they into Fatima at all? Just again, you've seen it firsthand. So, what are the differences in popular piety with the Uniates?
Well, I'll tell you, if you were to go to a Basilican church, they would be praying the rosary. And a Redemptorist church, they would be praying a rosary. Other parishes, it would vary. How it is in Ukraine, I'm not too sure. But if you come to a parish or a monastic community that's trying to get back to their more ancient roots, they would have no rosary at all. There are some that focusing on the rule of the Theotokos that Saint Seraphim of Sarov prayed, which is similar, but I mean the biggest difference is with the Dominican Rosary, you're focusing on the mysteries and you're using your imagination, where the Orthodox, they don't use the imagination. So that's one of the main differences between the rule of the Theotokos that Saint Seraphim of Sarov prayed and the various rosaries that Roman Catholics have.
And just so people are aware, we have, like in the Ladder Divine Descent, explicit warnings not to use imagination in prayer. We just had a show with Dr. Benjamin Heidgerken on Sunday, which I recommend people watch. It's so, if you understand the content of that show, you'll understand that there's differences that really cannot be bridged with Thomism and Orthodoxy. Now, that doesn't mean Roman Catholics can't dump Thomism and start acquiring Orthodox doctrines, but that's beside the point. And so what I'm getting at is St. Maximus teaches that a lot of our desire to sin and the reason we sin is because of our sensuality. Well, how do you get really sensual and even a hedonistic? Well, it starts with the imagination. It's almost like it's a hedonism of the intellect. And so imagination is how actually sin and passions entered into the human experience. And so it's sort of bizarre. If you understand Orthodox spirituality, it's sort of bizarre that you would then be in prayer where you're seeking to get closer to God, employing precisely the opposite approach, the approach that led to sin. You wouldn't want to bring to prayer. We're actually trying to, in prayer, inculcate ourselves with the mind of Christ. And so again, bizarre is the only word. I don't think people that are doing it are on purpose trying to do something that's bad. And just so people aren't aware, that doesn't mean you can never in your head think in your head, was that car red or is that green? That's not the sort of imagination we're talking about. But all that aside, how about iconography for that matter? Music. How's that different between the Uniates and the Orthodox? And is the difference important?
Well, for the most part, I think from my experience within the Uniates, the music is really good. I happen to be at a place where there's some very knowledgeable choir conductors and stuff, and we actually this one Dr. Melanie Turgeon, she's Ukrainian Catholic, and she had Rachmaninoff's all-night vigil, and in the choir was both Ukrainian Catholics, Ukrainian Orthodox, and even Russian Orthodox. Like, it was a mix, and they did it within the context of a liturgy, and a service. Sorry, not liturgy, in a service, and it was in Orthodox churches, because technically the Orthodox would not be able to participate if it was in a Ukrainian Catholic church. But it was in an OCA parish, and then the second one was actually in a Ukrainian Orthodox, actually in the cathedral. Mm-hmm. So musically, it's very, very good, what the Uniates have here, but we have very scholarly people where I live, and they really know what they're doing. So musically, yeah, I haven't really seen much of a difference. What was the other part of that question?
How about the iconography?
Iconography?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of it, it's not much difference. However, you will have a number of icons within the Eastern Catholics that don't make any theological sense to the Orthodox, such as the Holy Family. You'll have, I have seen an Eastern style icon of, I think it was Francis of Assisi. So they'll even incorporate, very non-Orthodox saints into iconography. And then you'll have icons of like the Sacred Heart and the Immaculate Heart of Mary which doesn't make any sense within Orthodoxy at all. So, I mean, the subject matter, there are some icons that don't make any sense to the Orthodox, but as far as trying to follow the ancient tradition of how to do iconography, many of them, they're trying to follow the authentic tradition in that regard.
Now, let me ask you this. How about saint canonizations? Have they canonized any saints from the 30s and 40s from the Gulag or the Russian Revolution? Are the Uniates are they vibrant when it comes to they still canonize their own saints, or they're like the Arminians and they haven't canonized saints in a long time?
Yeah, that has become a problem for them because they're no longer able to canonize their own saints. They got to wait for Rome to do it. And that can get very political, and they don't really get that much priority at the Vatican. And some of them get quite resentful about that. But I mean, you even have this within Roman Catholics. You talked about Franciscans, that why John Duns Scotus is only recognized as blessed rather than saint. And I mean, he's the whole reason why they even have the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. And so there's tension between the Franciscans and the Dominicans over that, and why Aquinas gets all the glory and Scotus, like, how many people even know he exists. So, I mean, you even get that within, just specifically in Roman Catholicism, but then with the Eastern Catholics, they're even less of a priority. So there is that. I know that there's Bishop Budka, I believe the name is. There's another one. It's been so many years, I forget his name now. That they've been really pushing to get them canonized, but that all depends on Rome doing it. So that is problematic. Oh,
and how about appointing their own bishops? Are they able to hold the synod of their own bishops and appoint their own metropolitan, or does the Pope of Rome have to appoint him?
Well, that I'm not completely sure how that. I think the Pope of Rome is involved. It was technically, if they have the status of patriarch, they don't actually need the approval of Rome, and they did come up with the title of major archbishop, and then there was controversy what that exactly means, and it was
but I think, I don't think Ukraine has a patriarch. I don't think Metropolitan Sviatochok is obviously not a patriarch, but I think you're thinking maybe the Melkites, right?
Well,
they don't need.
Absolutely. And then like the Syro-Malabar and the Syro-Malakari, like some of them have the title major archbishop. Some of them have patriarch or catholicos. However, with major archbishop Stanislav, it depends what parish you're in. They may refer to him in the liturgy as major archbishop, but especially in more recent years, there's a lot of parishes that refer to him as patriarch, even though he officially doesn't have that title given to him from the Vatican.
It didn't stop that dude in Kiev calling himself patriarch too, right?
So yes.
you know what I'm talking about. So anyway,
yeah.
So that being said, let me ask this.
Oh, wait. I don't know who I thought of someone. I think you're probably thinking of someone else.
Well, I'm thinking of
you that are claiming that title.
I'm talking about see, now this is terrible entertainment because you're making me Google Live.
Are you talking about the one who had a wife or not?
No, I'm talking the Kiev patriarch guy,
Yeah.
And let's see if we got his name up there. I'm doing it right now. Come on. I know his face. I could see his face in my mind. And I can't filler it.
Okay, Filaret. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether you were talking about Filaret or the new one, Epiphany.
So anyway, off to the next question, which would be this. In what ways is Uniatism, in your experience, again, you don't know every Uniate in the planet, haven't met every Uniate in the planet. In what way is Uniatism, in your experience, more or less ethnic than the Orthodox Church? Because we're stereotypically ethnic. We got the Russian food festivals and the borscht and all that. Did you get some sort of sense that the Uniates were more church-minded, less ethnic-minded, or vice versa?
Again, it would depend on parish to parish, but generally I found them actually more ethnic than the Moscow Patriarchate here in Canada, especially since, like at the cathedral, I obviously use primarily English because I only, so far, I only know a little bit of the liturgy in Slavonic. But the reason we are using Slavonic is because there's so many more recent immigrants, and they're not all from Russia. They're from many former Soviet bloc countries. Like even when the Georgians came here, there was no Georgian parish, so they were coming here. So the common language is Russian, but you're not going to have strictly Russian traditions because you have people from all over the place, and primarily the people that built this community were all Ukrainian. So traditionally, it's more of a Ukrainian focus than anything else. But if you want to get very ethnic, probably the most ethnic-oriented parish that I've been to was St. George's Ukrainian Catholic, and that was built by Ukrainians that came here around the time of World War II and afterwards. So they're very much focused on maintaining their Ukrainian heritage. And then you have the Ukrainian Orthodox in Canada, which is a different entity than the Ukrainian Orthodox in Ukraine, which kind of really confuses people. And were only more recently even acknowledged as being canonically Orthodox. And they came about basically by the people that came here who were Russian Orthodox. The immigrants, they came from Galicia and stuff, like parts of Ukraine, what's now Ukraine. Like when they came here, there wasn't Ukraine as we know it now. And then as well, there was a number of Eastern Catholics that came here. They weren't called Ukrainian Catholic yet either. I think that was in the 1960s. It was the partitioning of Poland where it stopped being called the Ruthenian Uniate Church, and then it was called the Greek Catholic Church, and it was sometime in the mid-60s, I believe, that they had the title Ukrainian put in there. And so it was these Eastern Catholics and Russian Orthodox that wanted clergy that spoke with their dialect, their Ukrainian kind of dialect. And it's rather than have a Latin priest or a priest that was more Russian. I mean, the first missionaries here came from Valam, so I mean, the focus was on missionizing the natives, not they didn't come here for the immigrants. And so they wanted clergy that spoke their same dialect, and they created this new entity called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So they have a number of traditions that don't quite make sense in the Orthodox tradition because they've brought them in from the Eastern Catholic tradition. So that they're very focused on their being very ethnic. So I found that the Ukrainian Orthodox and Ukrainian Catholics here are more focused on being keeping hold of their ethnic heritage than say the Russian Orthodox, because as I say, the Russian Orthodox is a real mixture.
And just in general, people forget Russia's very multi-ethnic.
Exactly.
And so just by Ukraine being, and we're talking Ukraine's even somewhat diverse. I mean, and it was even more so before they kicked out the Volga Germans and the Crimean Tatars. And I know people can say, oh, the Volga Germans technically weren't in Ukraine. You get the point. They had ethnic minorities, and Stalin kicked a lot of them out because of collaboration during World War II or alleged collaboration. But all that aside, Russia itself's got tons of different peoples and steppes and Asiatic peoples.
Yeah. Moldova is within the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate, but their main language is Romanian.
Yeah.
Or Roman, as they would say.
Yeah, no, it's, in fact, Father Paisi, who's... Father Paisi, who we will plug at the end of the show. Yeah. He's Moldovan, and he's Moscow Patriarch priest in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. So figure that out.
Right, yeah.
And he speaks English, and he speaks Romanian, speaks Russian. But that being said, let me ask this then. On Pascha, I presume, is not according to the old calendar. They do it according to Western Easter, right?
Well, you're talking about the Uniates. Yeah. Well, actually,
Yes. Yeah.
Within the city of Edmonton, there is one parish that's on the old calendar, and that's that St. George's that I mentioned. Now, the majority of the country parishes, my understanding is that they're all old calendar. And in fact, I remember visiting a family. I was when I was involved with the Uniates, I'd spent some time with a hero monk, and we went out to visit one particular family. And the one lady started, they were talking about having the bishop out, and says, "Well, he better not try to convince us to switch calendars because we're not going to do it." So the thing is, it all depends on the parish. So within the city limits, except for that one parish, they're all on the new calendar. So their Pascha would be the new calendar Pascha. But in the country parishes, in that one parish in Edmonton, they're all would be the same as the Orthodox.
Okay.
And it's really strange because you will have a priest covering multiple parishes, and some are on the old and some are on the new, which I'm sure gets very confusing.
Now, let me ask this. In Orthodox Church, they'll read the gospel in different languages, generally as long as they have people, different speakers. And when you watch a liturgy in Moscow, it's awesome how many languages they have. But even when I was in Herkimer, New York, there's an OCA parish about 15 minutes from Jordanville, Holy Trinity Monastery, they read it in Bulgarian, in German, in Russian, in Cambodian, and obviously in English, and Slavonic. So that's already 6 languages. So like you could even go to the local kind of not so spectacular Orthodox parish, and they will try to incorporate other languages when it's Pascha, and it's a way of preaching the gospel to all peoples in a way. Is there any sort of sense of that within Uniatism? Have you seen that there? Because I've seen that in Orthodox churches.
No, I haven't seen that at all. And in fact, before the Second Vatican Council,
do they sometimes do Ukrainian and Russian, or is it
No. It now it's pretty much all Ukrainian, except those that are really trying to get back to the more ancient traditions. Then they focus on being Slavonic.
Okay.
But and actually, my understanding is that them using Ukrainian, like the reason I'm focusing on Ukrainian is because that's what I know about. That's been my experience. I don't believe we even have any Ruthenian parishes here. And I only visited a few of the others, like the Maronites, and there was another one I can't remember that I visited once. So primarily the focus here is Ukrainian. So before the Second Vatican Council, they had to use Church Slavonic because that was the one that was approved by the Pope, because Cyril Methodius went down there because they had problems with the Frankish missionaries. And this is how they resolved the issues. They had the Pope of Rome on their side, so the Franks had to leave them alone. And so because the language was approved by the Pope, therefore that was the liturgical language that they were allowed to use. They couldn't use Ukrainian. And an interesting thing is, I know a priest who was the priestly fraternity of St. Peter. He specifically learned Slavonic, so he said the Tridentine Mass in Slavonic because their focus is the only 3 languages you can have in liturgy are Latin, Greek, and Slavonic. None others have been approved by the Pope, so you're not allowed to use any other languages. So he actually learned Slavonic so that he could specifically do the Tridentine Mass in Slavonic, which is really interesting.
Now, let me ask. Well, I forgot the question I asked, but I'm going to go to the next one then, which would be this. Let's talk about something positive, right? You talked about a hero monk. You don't want to change the calendar. He sounds like a godly guy. So what are some of the best things about being a Uniate, and maybe some aspects the best Uniates you know?
I don't know. The food is great. There's always, you go there, they got no problem.
Food.
Let's party, let's have a good time. Like this. I mean, if you put aside all the differences, as long as you don't talk about this stuff, you don't get into controversy, everything's fine. There's no big deal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that was one thing about.
All right, and
I mean,
well, how about piety though? Like,
that's
what kind of man was the monk though? Like, we know.
Sorry,
but how about the Uniate monastics and everything? Is there a certain Orthodox piety among the Uniate monastics, or is it peculiar in some way?
Well, it varies because I mean, you will have the Basilians, which are very, very, very Latinized, and then you'll have ones that they try to follow the idea of the Studites. It was an idea that was put together by it was the Shatipsky brothers, who the whole idea was a more authentic Eastern version of monasticism. So it depends whether it's the ones that are just going along with all the Latinizations, and then there's the others that are trying to reform and get back to more appearing to be like the Orthodox.
Now, let me ask this for fun, which would be, if a normal Italian or Irish parish is 10 out of 10 Roman Catholic, all right, and if we're going to say someone doing a mass only Latin's 11 out of 10, right, we'll give them some extra credit there. And if we're going to say a Moscow Patriarchate parish is 0 out of 10 Latin, what would you rate? And just put these percent. Let's say an Osea parish is 2 out of 10 Latinized. Where would we put the Maronites in that scale, 0 to 10? 10 being Latinized, 0 being totally Orthodox.
My understanding, well,
and we're dealing with stereotypes. Not every Osea parish is like that.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, is that the whole idea of, I don't quite understand that Latinization thing, because that seems to be a problem with the Eastern Catholics. I understand that there were some Latinization with the Orthodox, but generally,
are the Maronites
problem?
The Maronites
are. I did go to a couple services, and I mean, I was quite. I just assumed, that I'd be experiencing the liturgy of St. James. But it was basically a Roman Catholic mass in Arabic. So, I mean, it was
okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was strange. But then I heard other people say, "Well, that you had a bad experience. Like that wasn't the right way." Like it's really confusing. I really can't answer that because I don't have that much experience.
And so, let me see. I've never been to a Uniate service, and to be honest, I'd be legitimately intrigued because I just find all this historical stuff intriguing. And so if I, as an Orthodox Christian, walked into a Uniate service, would I feel at home or would it be somewhat awkward?
It would depend where you went.
Okay.
I mean, I went into Ruthenian parishes where there was an organ. They weren't using it, but at one time they did use it in the service.
Did they get it from the Greeks?
I don't know. I know the one time.
Okay,
the one time I went to the Greek parish. This is before I was ordained, and afterwards, we go for coffee where everyone gets a shot of Metaxa and their coffee, and I kind of make a beeline for the least Greek-looking person there, and she was Russian, and her fiance was Greek, and then they eventually started going to the OCA parish. That was like the where things meet, it wasn't Greek and it wasn't Russian.
Well, and let me ask this, and just so the audience knows, you have questions, your last opportunity to ask questions. Do Uniates ever kind of meander? Like, are they like Melkites where they'll meander between churches? Do Uniates ever marry into the Orthodox and become Orthodox and vice versa? Or are they less like the Melkites and the Ukrainian Uniates are more rigid? They will not leave Uniatism and they'll not dabble with Orthodoxy.
Well, from what I've experienced, the Uniates don't understand. They personally think they're the same as the Orthodox, and they don't understand what the differences are. So they would see no problem in that. The thing is that that kind of became evident that wasn't completely true when I became Orthodox, because then suddenly that was a problem. But before I became Orthodox, generally it's like there's no difference between us and the Orthodox. But when I became Orthodox, then it was evident that there was a very serious difference, but they couldn't really describe what that difference was.
Well, how about you describe that for us now?
Well, I actually kind of mentioned it a few times, and it had to do with the filioque and all that, specifically for me, that I saw that it's an intellectual thing. The whole idea is that it's the mind, the human intellect trying to figure everything out, rather than focusing on noetic knowledge, divine revelation. That is the main difference. I mean, it's the same difference between Roman Catholics and the Orthodox. It's the exact that is the underlying difference between the Orthodox and everybody else in the entire world. That is the difference. And I mean, even the way that passage, Matthew 16, is interpreted, with "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." That's the key there. That's the rock. It's the faith, the rock faith of Peter. It's being received through the Holy Spirit. It's not an intellectual process. And that is the key difference. That is the key difference between orthodoxy and everything else. And that is the problem with the filioque, in that you actually don't need to actually believe in the divinity of the Holy Spirit to confess the filioque. Or there's various ways to interpret it. And so really the filioque is ecumenical, because you're allowed to commune when you don't actually believe in real Trinitarian theology, because you can actually profess the filioque without understanding the Trinity. You can actually deny the divinity of the Holy Spirit and still commune with the filioque. And that is the problem with the filioque. So the filioque is actually ecumenical.
Now, it sounds like this started with me asking what's the best thing about Uniatism, and you said the food. Are there any particularly pious people, like, for example, when I was a Protestant, very nice Protestants, but when you become Orthodox, you find people of a spiritual plane way above what you ever found as a Protestant. So my question would be, are there Uniats at that high level spiritual plane, or they're like a step below? Or, again, your just general sense of it. Are there really pious Uniats, Uniat monks, Uniat bishops?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, like I can't remember whether we were live at this time or not, but when I mentioned that at one time, when my wife was going to Ukrainian Catholic Church and I was still Roman Catholic, and I was taking our children to Sunday Mass, and I'd be taking her to the Divine Liturgy in the evening, I joked that I'd go to church every day and twice on Sunday. I actually really, really enjoyed going to the Basilian Church because the homilies were so much better. There was so much, it was much more pious than the Roman Catholic Mass that I was going to. And then I also started going to the Latin Mass as well. So, I mean, like the Latin Mass was a step above than your average Roman Catholic parish. All the Ukrainian Catholic parishes were a step above than the majority of the Roman Catholic parishes. And then, of course, it's all on an individual basis, how serious a person is about their faith. So you will find very, very pious Uniates. You'll find very pious Roman Catholics. You'll find very pious Protestants. So
well, let me ask this: Are there any Uniat hermits still? Are there any Uniat, any extreme asceticism within Uniatism? Because obviously that's had to decline even within Eastern Orthodoxy. Have the Uniats maintained some of the ultra strict asceticism in any quarters?
There are a number that are following, the strict monastic rules and stuff that would be required in a strict, like in a regular strict Orthodox monastery. But as far as having like extreme aesthetics, like way out in the wilderness, hermits and stuff, or the really extreme, like even as far as Father Seraphim Rose, nothing on that level. But as far as
not even in Canada, you guys have a lot of trees and mountains.
Trees. Oh yeah. Well, they would love to do that. Well, I know that there's this one Haramuk where he's very much following all the necessary rules, like everything that's laid out there for the monastic life, the very traditional Slavic monastic. He's definitely focusing on doing that, and he is doing that. But as far as the next level, the great aesthetics, well, there's nothing quite that extreme. But I mean, you have that in the Orthodox now. There's very, very few. We've a lot of the ones that were recognized have all passed away recently within the last couple decades.
Just so people wonder, hear the door fling open. That's my kid trying to jump in my arms.
Well, those incidents are my wife's favorite parts of your live streams.
There you go. So it's we're going to hopefully my wife's giving him a bath, and in the meantime, I'm going to start getting to audience questions after I ask you one last question, which would be, what's the worst thing about Uniatism in your mind? We talked about the best. What's the worst?
Well, I would say that I actually mentioned it already, that they claim that they are the same as the Orthodox, but when it comes down to it, they have no explanation for why they can't explain what the differences are between them. Like, why do the Orthodox believe this? They can't say that. And then when I became Orthodox, this was suddenly a bad thing, even though before that they had no problem with Orthodox. So the thing is, that's kind of two-faced, really. So that, to me, was the worst thing, that there is some dishonesty there.
Now, if people go to orthochristian.com, I just think people should be aware that there's, to this day, a lot of ethnic strife, and it's not strictly unions. Unions also includes people that are now in communion with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. But there is a lot of ethnic strife where, just like Roman Catholicism kind of got tied into some of the stuff in Ireland, doesn't mean there were very religious Roman Catholics in all reality. The same is true of Uniatism in Ukraine. And so for people you need to have at least some idea of that to understand, well, yes, the Waffen SS had Uniate, chaplains and stuff like that. And it doesn't mean they were peculiar in that regard, and that in every way which they capitulated to these things. But it's something someone to be aware of, because again, that East-West divide within Ukraine, and in many respects, it helps you kind of figure out, this is why you get along with people in another part of Ukraine, and there's those ethnic differences that you're referring to, that they want only things in Ukrainian, and things to that effect. So anyway, let's do some audience questions. And Zebby asked, and we'll try to keep the answers to 40 words or less, what kind of interactions are there between the different Uniate churches themselves? So they have any interaction, Deacon John?
There was, let's see, I forget which community it was that was getting established here. They were using the facilities of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. I haven't really seen much between the Maronites and the Ukrainian Catholics, but between the Maronites and the Roman Catholics, there's lots of interaction. There was the Catholicos of, I always get the two mixed up. There's the Syro-Malabar and the Syro-Malakari. I believe he was the Catholicos of the Syro, I can't remember. One of them. I have to look it up each time. I always mix them up. So I apologize to everyone in India. It's kind of like mixing up your right hand and your left hand.
You better apologize to India. They're good people.
Yeah, they are. my wife gets very mad about this whole thing with these people phoning saying they're Microsoft support or whatever. She's saying because we have friends from India, and says that's horrible. It's like they're going to make people not like Indians, and they're lovely people. So my wife gets really mad at these con artists. But he came here, and I was quite excited because I wanted to experience this Indian liturgy, and they ended up doing a Roman Catholic Mass in English.
That's not fun.
Well, that was not fun at all. So I mean, that was that was too bad.
You wanted Marliam, or however you pronounce it. Hopefully,
yeah.
We may have one of those Roman Catholic Uniats on real soon. So keep your eyes peeled to that. We have this question: What is keeping the Melkites and other Eastern Catholics from going back to Orthodoxy? Given how Rome is, why would they want to stay? Father Deacon?
I don't know. I don't know. They complain a lot about how they're mistreated by the Vatican. Yet, I don't know.
My personal opinion is these are really ethnic and historical allegiances.
Yeah,
and it's not necessarily even necessarily negative. It's sort of like being born Italian and like I'm just going to be Roman Catholic. It's because I'm Italian. So your clan or your region has been X for so long, it's just hard to imagine yourself not being that. And to the Melkites' credit, they kind of really legitimately have the patriarchate. Because what happened is when that patriarch became a Roman Catholic heretic by joining the Unia, Constantinople went and appointed a new patriarch, right? It wasn't even like they locally did it. So they kind of took some guy with Ottoman support and sent them there. So you can see how that could kind of feel not so legit.
Yeah.
And to this day, the Lebanese and the Syrians are kind of split 50-50 because of that. So we have this comment from the Archangel Michael, at least that's what his handle is. I just officially left the Union Church. It is in no way similar to true Orthodoxy. It is much Latinized. God finally led me through his grace to Rocor. So that's a great news. We have this from Alexandria Union. Pray for us, St. Alexis Toth, former Hindu, Protestant, Roman Catholic here, never considering Union path after vomiting out France. Lord have mercy on me. So Alexandria seems to have been around the block a few times when it comes to the faith traditions.
You know what's interesting with St. Alexander Toth is that there's a lot of Eastern Catholics who admire him and venerate him, even commemorate him, because it's the idea that he was a lot of Eastern Catholics feel, well, they were oppressed and Latinized, and they resent that, and they're trying to fight to get their authentic tradition. So even though he ended up becoming Orthodox, they still admire what he did. I mean, that's why they have no problem with St. Photius the Great or Mark of Ephesus. It's because it's like, well, they were right. The Eastern Catholics will say they were right.
Yeah, it's
on most issues. There will be some issues which they would rather avoid altogether, but more or less they're saying with their advice that they were being abused by Rome.
Yeah, in the capital region when I lived there, and that's where my wife and I became Orthodox. Capital region is like Albany, New York. There's a Union church it's not Watervliet, it's the town across from it. I can't remember. Is it still Watervliet? Well, point being is, you talk to the local Union priest there, and he's asked, well, if you want to be Roman Catholic or Orthodox, what would you be? And he said, Orthodox. We're not Roman Catholics, but you're communion the Pope. He's like, no, we're not really. So like, there could be this popular imagination that it's like, we're just aligned this way. We've been like this for a long time. And that's why I show people the maps. In some areas, this goes to Lithuania filling in after the Golden Horde came in 1239 to 1242.
Yeah.
This 800 years. So it's, in some respects, sometimes it's incredible to think that there's, at this point, any sort of semblance of Eastern spirituality. And that, I think, shows God's grace that a lot of people haven't been totally Latinized at this point. And I think people forget Latinization is fairly late in history of a lot of peoples. I mean, Southern Italy, We're talking about in the 1800s, right? And it's Italy, right? And you were talking about late 1800s. And to this day, there's still one Italo-Greek monastery. There's only 3 monks left, but it still exists today. So that's what people have to realize, that the faith originally, well, it is Orthodox. It was everywhere else Orthodox. And it takes a long time for the true faith to die, especially where people are faithful. And
Right.
and so Latinization is not as widespread in every corner as some people popularly imagine.
Right.
So,
Well, I know one example is Saint Maxim Sandovich. The thing is, his family was they were all Uniates, and it wasn't until he went to the Basilian Seminary that he really saw what the difference was, and then he went to Pachaev and became Orthodox. But the thing is that the simple village life, you were either Orthodox or you were Uniate, depending upon which army was in control of your land, and it really didn't matter to the simple people. It didn't matter at all. The parish that I'm actually attached to was originally a Ukrainian Catholic parish. Well, I guess originally, it wasn't called Ukrainian Catholic; it was Greek Catholic originally. And they realized, well, we're no longer under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so why don't we go back to our original faith? And so they merged with a parish of the Moscow Patriarchate that was just down the road. And since they had the bigger building, that's where they all started going to church. So, it's a lot of it's very political, and a lot of the simple people that don't understand what the differences are, it's like that guy on the island with 2 churches. It's like, well, this is the one I go to, and that's the one I don't go to. That's basically how they know the difference. So, for the simple people that don't understand all the complexities, it's very confusing for them.
and just some people, like, even though we talk about these East-West generalizations, it's not like once you pass a certain longitude, they all become Uniate. It's pitch patchy, you know?
Yeah.
And so there's Orthodox, there's Uniates. You get that when you get into the Carpathian Mountains, when you're not even parts of Ukraine, parts of, which would have been Romania back then, and I forget, Hungary and stuff like that. And so, in Poland. So
I mentioned Pachaev, like that's very far west. And the thing is, you have the Polish Orthodox as well. I know Metropolitan Sava, like with what's been going on in Ukraine, he's very outspoken. He's very, my wife says it's because he's Polish. If something needs to be said, leave it to the Polish, because she's half Ukrainian, half Polish.
And let me add this: people don't realize that a lot of Latinizing were persecutions against the Uniates.
Yeah.
And this often drove the Uniates into the arms of the Orthodox. So, like, a kind of meme history is that in the Eparchy of Kelm, it was an Orthodox crusade, and they forced all these Poles to become Orthodox. But if you actually look at the history, what really happened was the Poles didn't want them to be Eastern Catholic anymore, and they refused to send them a bishop. They didn't let the Pope send a bishop. They didn't want them to be Eastern Catholic anymore. And at this time, they were along, the partition of Poland. They were within the Russian Empire. And so they had a Uniate, administrator, I forget his name, but essentially he couldn't get a bishop. And this guy was a scoundrel, by the way. But the point being is, they made the scoundrel a bishop, and he took all of them into Eastern Orthodoxy simply because they couldn't get an Eastern Catholic bishop at that point. And they wanted to Latinize them. And so does it mean everyone in Kelm was on board? Absolutely not. After the 1905 revolution, and they kind of eased some of the religious laws and controls, about a little less than 1/3 flat out became Latin Rite. They didn't want to be Eastern Catholic, and they didn't want to be Orthodox. So you get some of these kind of ethnic differences and these local differences, but people forget a lot of these Latin policies were against Eastern Catholics, and that's why St. Alexis Toth comes around. He brought Uniates en masse into the Orthodox Church because, like, they didn't recognize the fact that he was married and stuff like that. You go, wait, is this yesterday's news? And there was a lot of division within the Roman Catholic Church at this time, and a lot of these political decisions were made by who was the king of Poland. No, there's no more king of Poland, so now what you do, and all these different issues. So sadly, because I got to get going, I'm going to wrap this up. This is a conversation we should keep having. And if you guys have questions, please type them out. But I want to say real quickly, before I thank our guest, Father Deacon John, if this show has blessed you, please go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Again, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. It's very important. I was just contacted by Father Paisi. They need to raise $2,000 to retranslate the liturgy into Khmer and republish it. And it's because, and my wife will attest to it, the original translation of the liturgy is kind of bad. It wasn't done by Khmer speakers. I think it was done by Russians in Petrograd that learned Khmer. And she said it's hard to understand. So please bless the Cambodian people. They're looking for donations of $100 or more, but quite frankly, you have $1, $5, every little bit counts. And I had to talk Father Paisi out of saying, we'll send a liturgical book from Cambodia to everyone that donates more than $100. And I said, Father, if you're going to mail those from Cambodia, it's going to cost like $100 to send the guy the book. You just negated all the money they donated. So let's not do that. So out of the goodness of your heart, please go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate and consider helping the publishing and retranslation of the liturgy in Khmer. That's the Cambodian language. And lastly, it doesn't have to be that. Please pray for me and pray for Deacon John. Take some time to pray for us. Pray for the growth of the Church Cambodia. Pray for our church and our leaders. Give alms. Donate to your local monastery. They've been faithful, especially during COVID. They've kept the church doors open, kept the worship alive. If this has blessed you, bless someone else, and God will bless you somehow. Again, we're not name it and claim it sort of people. So you'll be blessed somehow. Maybe your health will deteriorate and you'll lose all your money. I don't know. This is not a plan to a better life, but God will save your soul. So please do that. And other than that, I'll just very quickly, because someone asked, we covered this earlier in the show. Uniate has become a pejorative, but it used to not be a pejorative. And we get this from someone from Southern Poland. I live in Southern Poland. Uniates often don't agree with Vatican or bishops, but they are Uniates, not Orthodox, because of tradition. It's a thing here. Yeah. So we should be tolerant that, yes, it's a thing. And you kind of have to understand this stuff within culture. Some of this stuff is culturally foreign. And this is why, especially meme Roman Catholic apologetics, it says you could be Orthodox and not have the Pope. It's literally like they say LARPing. You're really not into Uniatism in that way, at least not in reality. You're not really understanding what Uniatism really is to the Uniates themselves. So hopefully this show has helped people kind of start wrapping their minds around it. And that's pretty much it. That's all I have to say. Father Deacon, thank you so much for coming on. Any last comments?
Well, I actually was thinking, like, one thing that really helps out is to understand the politics in that part of the world, in Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania. And one story that's true, I was told is true, is that there were 3 brothers. They were born in the same town, in the same house, in 3 different countries. So you got to realize it's a difficult place to live. You don't know what's on your birth certificate. It may not be where your driver license is from, even though you're living in the same house. So, I mean, with that kind of politics going on, and then some countries are Roman Catholic, some are Orthodox, it's just going to be chaos. And that's how this all came about, at least that part of the world. You go down to India and stuff, similar stories, but they're different because it's different cultures and different politics.
Well, not everywhere is as big as Canada, nor as friendly as the Canadian people, that's for sure. But we will leave it there this evening, and I will end the show as I end all my shows by saying, fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you, as Jesus of Sirach says. God bless you all. Have a good night.
Good night.